As Professor Cohen explains, the religious, social, and economic factors that led to the development of anti-Semitism in Christian Europe were absent in the Muslim world, as opposed to Christian Europe where Jews were often singled out as a demonic and destructive force. Islam did not attribute satanic powers to the Jews. When Jews were discriminated against, it was mostly because they belonged to the Zimmi class as a whole, rather than to the Jewish religion in particular. Furthermore, during this time period, Jews were not perceived as a major threat to Islam. It was rather the Christians who, as rulers and members of the opposing imperial forces, were seen as an imminent danger to Islamic dominance and expansion. When then does anti-Semitism begin to evolve in the Islamic and Arab world, and what form does it take? As we will now see, a shift in the way Jews were treated and perceived began in the 19th century.
I consider anti-Semitism as a phenomenon which developed since the mid-19th century. It started as an imported kind of ideas which infiltrated or permeated the Middle Eastern societies at the beginning by different missionaries, Christian missionaries, who brought it to the Middle East with their missions. And from there, with the changes in the Middle East, the penetration of colonial powers, new ideas, changes in the political order, and of course Zionism, three major factors which somehow is combined to create a new perception of the Jews of the Middle East.
It appears then that the development of anti-Semitism in the Arab and Islamic world is related to three major factors: the importation of European ideologies and concepts into this sphere, the collapse of traditional political systems and the loyalties and practices associated with them, and the appearance of Zionism. Let's first turn to the penetration of ideas and ideologies into the Muslim world. Anti-Semitic perceptions of European Christian origin made their first major appearance in the Middle East with the Damascus Affair of 1840, one of the notorious blood libels of modern times. The affair began with the disappearance of an Italian monk and his native servant. Rumors began to spread across the Christian quarter of Damascus that the local Jews had murdered the two in order to obtain their blood for the baking of the matzah, the unleavened bread traditionally eaten on Passover. This accusation was followed by the imprisonment and torture by the local authorities of several Jews and led to acts of violent pillaging of the Jewish community. Several Jews had lost their lives as a result of the brutality that erupted. Eventually, following the intercession of Jewish communities in Europe and governments in the West, the Ottoman Sultan himself intervened, explicitly denouncing the libel. The surviving arrested Jews were released. Prior to the events in Damascus, the blood libel was not typical to the Arab and Muslim discourse in the Middle East. However, following 1840, this medieval Christian accusation began to take root in the popular imagination of the area. The events surrounding the Damascus Affair reflected the growing interference of European forces in the region. It was also during this time that the Ottoman Empire introduced a set of modernizing reforms that included the gradual institution of legal steps that released non-Muslims from their inferior status in society, completely changing the traditional political systems. Notions of civil equality were introduced to the area, disrupting the traditional societal structures and destabilizing Muslim and non-Muslim relations. Combined with the new political philosophies that infiltrated the regions of the empire, such as nationalism and socialism, these changes would prove to have a lasting negative effect on the way Jews and other non-Muslims were perceived and treated.
The term equality was strange, was new for Muslim and Arab societies. They were the subjects of the Sultan exactly as non-Muslim minorities. However, their status was different. They were the Muslims, they were the masters, and they were used to it, that the non-Muslim communities was a kind of a second-grade subject. And here we are with the new reforms. Somehow the whole world is starting to change, and Christians or Jews could get involved in things which they never could do previously. If you add to this other concepts like nationalism, capitalism, socialism, all these isms, which also infiltrated and came by the colonial powers, it changed and it somehow undermined the regular world order to which they were used to. And this created tensions between communities, non-Muslim communities and Muslim communities, which did not happen in the past. Because most of them, although they lived in different quarters, they were used to interact in a much more, I wouldn't say equal, but at least on a daily basis. All these created a new atmosphere and a new attitude, not only towards the Jews, but also towards Christians, who were in fact the first to suffer from these new tensions and changing loyalties.
As pointed out, one of the ideologies brought to the Middle East in the 19th century by European forces was nationalism, which spread across the Arab world, gaining prominence mainly in the early 20th century. In the second week of the course, we saw how the emergence of nationalism in 19th century Europe brought with it questions of national identity and of otherness and belonging. We saw how these questions affected, among other things, the rise of modern forms of anti-Semitism in Europe. How then did nationalist ideas influence the identities and self-perceptions of the peoples living in the Islamic and Arab world? And how did it affect the perception of the Jews?
Nationalism, in many ways, is an imported term, and not only term, but notion, because in the past, the Ottoman Empire or any other Muslim empire did not differentiate between different nationalities or ethnic groups. They were all under Muslim rule. With the advent of nationalism, new definitions to people had to be discussed or imposed in different parts of the Muslim world, because people in Egypt felt, for instance, itself as a different political unit from the very beginning, with its special history. What is known as Turkey today was also the same thing, and the Arab nationalism. We have, since the late 19th century, three different kinds of nationalism emerging in the Middle East. One is Egyptian, one is Turkish, and one is Arab. By trying to define who belongs to this nationalism, different groups that felt relatively safe under Muslim rule started to be excluded from the definition of nationalism, especially when nationalism acquired a religion as one of its determinators. And this occurred in the course of the 1930s, 1920s, when really the discussions, the intellectual discussions about nationalism were at their peak. But once you take religion as one of the determinators of nationalism, you in fact include many other groups. And one of them is, of course, the Jews. Originally, nationalism was in many ways brought by Christians from Europe and developed to and adapted to the Arab and Muslim societies. But the fact that Islam became one of the elements which are required in order to be a national or an Egyptian or an Arab, then you cannot find Jews so much in it. That doesn't say that Jews were not involved in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in the national movements in Egypt, in Iraq, in North Africa, in different places. It was not as grave as it developed over the years.
This increasing foreign political and cultural presence, together with the geopolitical weakness of the Muslim world at the time, created a sense of deep crisis among Muslims in the 19th century. This crisis brought about a worsening in the attitude towards Christian and Jewish minorities, who were identified as the main beneficiaries of expanding Western influence and dominance. As we will see, these minorities were now seen as rising above their allotted inferior place in the societal hierarchy.
In Islam, there is a perception that Islam, since Islam came after Judaism and Christianity, and Islam completed the divine revelation of Judaism and Christianity, Islam superseded previous religions, and therefore Islam should be on top. There is a saying in Arabic, I will say it in Arabic, Al-Islam ya'lu wa la yu'la alayhi, which means Islam should be on top and nothing could be above Islam. This perception conformed with historical reality when Muslim countries, Muslim empires were indeed powerful and very successful. However, in the 19th century, when the strategic, economic, social, and scientific balance of power changed in favor of the West, of Western countries against Islam, this led to a major, I would say, theological and also psychological crisis among Muslims. How can it be that Muslims are now weaker or inferior to infidels? And this sense of bewilderment or loss of confidence also led to loss of tolerance toward minorities, fear of the minorities, and we can see a direct correlation between the worsening situation of Muslims on the one side and growing intolerance toward minorities.
We can see then how the infiltration of European concepts into the Muslim world, together with the changing social structure and the loss of dominance, affected the development of anti-Semitism in this sphere. To these two factors, a third factor, which has already been mentioned, should be added: the emergence of Zionism, the Jewish national movement. Gaining momentum in a time of instability for the Muslim world, when anti-Semitic beliefs and attitudes were already gaining hold, Zionism would have a crucial effect on the further advancement of anti-Semitism in this sphere. As discussed in the second week, from the late 19th century through the early 20th century, the Zionist movement was emerging in Europe, bringing with it the early national Jewish immigration waves, or aliyot, to Palestine. The Arab populations residing in the region viewed the settling of the newcomers in the area, which at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire, as a threat, fueling the new anti-Jewish attitudes that were developing at the time. The sense of instability and imminent threat that was felt in the Islamic world in the 19th and early 20th centuries was greatly aggravated following the First World War. As mentioned in Week 2, world empires, including the Ottoman Empire, were broken up after the war and were replaced by nation-states in Europe and the Middle East. In Palestine, where a British mandate was set up instead of the Ottoman institutions, Zionism was gaining legitimacy. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, which we have already mentioned, acknowledged a Jewish right for a homeland in mandatory Palestine and resulted in great hostility around the Arab world. The power balance in the Middle East was changing. Anti-Zionist and anti-British sentiments were rising, and sporadic assaults on Jewish communities and institutions around the country took place as the struggle surrounding the future borders of post-mandate Palestine was fought over. As we will now see, all of these would have a decisive effect on the content and spread of anti-Semitism in the Arab and Islamic world.
Anti-Semitism in the Muslim world or in the Arab world witnessed a significant rise after the First World War. The First World War is a major historical turning point in the history of the Middle East, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, with the completion of European takeover of Middle Eastern countries, and with the emergence of Zionism and the Balfour Declaration. This sense of crisis exacerbated the need to find an explanation and a scapegoat, and it is manifested in the translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion to Arabic. It is manifested in the anti-Semitic ideology of the Muslim Brothers, and most importantly, it is also manifested in a series of pogroms against Jewish communities as a result of anti-Zionism. The first major pogrom is in Baghdad in April 1941, following the collapse of the anti-British movement. Right before the British recaptured Baghdad for 2 days, and right before the Passover holiday, there was a major pogrom against Jews. Approximately between 150 or 200 Jews were murdered. Many hundreds of Jews were injured, and Jewish property was looted. This was very much a manifestation of anti-British feelings, anti-Zionist but expressed against the local Jewish community. Then in 1945, there was also a small pogrom against Jews in the city of Tripoli in today's Libya. And in 1948, when the Muslim Brothers tried to mobilize support for the fight in Palestine against Zionism, at the same time, they also carried out a pogrom against the Jews of Cairo, because if you fight the Jews in one place, why not fight them in another place as well? And again, these Jewish communities in Arab countries, who were not necessarily very Zionist at that time, were punished because of Arab animosity toward Zionism. In a sense, here the Jews were associated, all the Jews, whatever their attitudes and whatever their feelings were all associated with Zionism. All the Jews are responsible for whatever any other Jews does, which is again a typical anti-Semitic phenomenon.
We can see then that anti-Semitic attitudes became widespread after World War I, particularly following the Balfour Declaration and the establishment of the Palestinian Mandate under Great Britain. The decades following the war created a fertile ground for the strengthening of imported anti-Semitic perceptions and for the reappearance of anti-Jewish Islamic traditions. The spread of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as well as anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda served to further this. During the immediate post-World War II era, anti-Semitic and vehement anti-Zionist rhetoric and actions were worsened by the Jewish-Arab struggle over the future of Palestine, as well as by the pressing problem of Jewish Holocaust survivors who sought refuge in Palestine. Things reached a boiling point with the UN Partition Plan of 1947, the subsequent war, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and the ensuing Arab-Israeli conflict. Though anti-Semitism was not the root cause of the conflict, it has been exacerbated by it, aggravating its representations and serving as an additional tool for the delegitimization and dehumanization of the other, Zionism and Israel. The founding of the State of Israel created a confluence of political and religious interests. The negative perceptions of the Jews found in the Quran were joined with European anti-Semitic ideas, creating a new form of anti-Semitism that flourished openly. This stood in contrast to the general turning away from anti-Semitism in the West after the Holocaust. The quantity and fury of anti-Semitic literature published in the Middle East increased, and during certain periods was printed partially under governmental auspices. The Six-Day War of 1967 and the swift Israeli victory over Arab armies furthered this process. The war dealt a shocking blow to the Arab world, and it generated unrest that continued to be channeled against Israel, Zionism, and the Jews.